Hello and welcome to this videocast and podcast for subscribers to davidicke.com. And I'll start with a question. If you want to know and ensure the outcome of a football match before the first ball is kicked, what do you have to do? Well, the answer, of course, is you have to control both sides and you have to control the referee. Because if you only control one team, you will influence the game, the outcome, but you won't know what it's going to be before the game starts. And so anyone who wishes to control an outcome in any situation must control both sides and the referee, the rules, the game itself, or in other situations, multiple sides, whatever they may be. And that is how the cabal that dictates the direction of the world and dictates major society transforming world events runs its game. You know, there's this idea among many people who, even those that accept that there is this cabal, that they basically work through the rich and famous, the establishment. But if they only did that, they wouldn't be controlling all aspects of what they wanted to dictate to achieve the outcome. And what a lot of people don't realize and do not appreciate is that if you take the political spectrum, they manipulate those that are of the left, of what have become known as progressives, progressive people, progressive organizations, which is about campaigning for freedom and justice and fairness and what have you. That arena is targeted just as much by this cabal as the establishment. In fact, so much of what has become known as the progressive arena, progressive organizations, have actually, and progressive political parties, have become part of the establishment while thinking they're challenging it. And I've spent much of my life, certainly the last more than a quarter of a century, campaigning daily in many and various ways for freedom, protection of freedom, for justice, for fairness, for all the things that these progressive groups of the left would support. But if we're not streetwise, and if we don't research what's really going on, we don't understand what the game really is, and much of the left and progressives will dismiss any idea of some global conspiracy. If we don't understand that, then we can be played like a stringed instrument by the very forces that we think we are protesting against. And I'm going to talk about this, both sides of the Atlantic today. And if the left, the progressives, don't start to understand and take the trouble to find out how the game is played and who's behind the game, then they'll go on being manipulated to do what the game wants them to do while they think they're challenging the establishment. First of all, this side of the water in Britain. We're having this EU referendum in June to decide if the British people want to stay in the European Union or come out. Now, as I've been pointing out for decade after decade, the European Union was created from the start to be totalitarian, tiptoed step by step into what it's become and what it's meant to become, even more so. And that is a centralized fascist communist dictatorship run by dark suit bureaucrats on behalf of the hidden hand. To take away national sovereignty, to break Europe up into regions, to dictate everything from a central point in Brussels, to control the entirety of the European economy and finance, and to become a state in and of itself, with what we now call countries subordinate satellites to this power structure. It's bad for everyone except those that are at the core running it and those behind those who appear to be running it. And so it is sickening to my bone marrow to witness the grotesque sight of so-called progressive political parties in this country. The Labour Party, the Scottish National Party, the Liberal Democrats, the Greens, all united in their desire to persuade the British people to vote to stay in that little lot, the EU. Now, some of them, key people here and there, mostly in the shadows, will know what the European Union is really about and will be campaigning through these organisations, not just the parties but others I'll come to in a second, to bring about this outcome of staying in the EU. But the vast majority of people in those parties and these other groups, progressive groups, will be campaigning to stay in the EU because they are completely ignorant of what the EU is about, what it's there to do, what its intentions are, and how it's been orchestrated to be what it is now and what it is designed to become from the day that it was created as a free trade area. As Martin Luther King said, there is nothing in the world more dangerous than conscientious ignorance and sincere ignorance. So, we had the leader of the British Labour Party, the opposition party, the main opposition party in the London Parliament, Westminster Parliament, Jeremy Corbyn, who has spent his political career up to this point opposing the European Union and pointing out very correctly what the organisation is really about. And this week he made a speech supporting Britain staying in the EU. And he now stands alongside all those other so-called progressive parties and the Cameron wing of the Conservative Party. And you would find it very difficult to get those parties to agree on almost anything else. And yet, here they are, all agreed to stay in this grotesque destroyer of freedom, and we've seen nothing yet. And you'll see also other progressive groups. Take Friends of the Earth, for instance, the environmental campaigning group, but so many others who support staying in the EU and yet are funded to a fantastic extent collectively by the EU. Here we have Friends of the Earth Europe, for instance, that gets massive funding from the European Union, and we're asked to believe that that does not influence its decision to campaign and try to get its members around the country to campaign to keep Britain in the EU. You know, the number of organisations that the European Union funds is unbelievable. And then what happens is when there's a problem and the EU needs support, like now in this referendum, all these organisations come out and say, oh, we ought to stay in the EU, yeah, it's good, without mentioning that they're all on the payroll. So what's happened is that the EU has funded all these groups, bought them basically, and then it gets the groups it funds to campaign for it to do things with regard to the particular subject area involved that mean that the EU takes more power to the centre to deal with these situations that these EU-funded groups are demanding that they deal with. It's a complete stitch-up wherever you look. We have politicians campaigning to stay in the EU who say, oh, look at all these groups that are supporting staying in. What they don't mention is that these groups are funded by the EU. Therefore, they have something to lose if we come out and take our freedom back, or some of it. We have the BBC that is at the centre in the mainstream media in this country, at the centre of this whole in-out debate, that takes funding from the EU. Took a Freedom of Information request to pull it out of them. How can you be independent of the EU in a debate when you're taking funding from it? And then there's this Friends of the Earth round document that was sent around to all the members of Friends of the Earth, demanding or asking, encouraging that other members around the country campaign to stay in the EU. And they're saying, if you'd like to send us, we'd like you to have campaigning materials such as leaflets, and if you're organising an event, we'll try to get a speaker there. It's all orchestrated by what should be an environmental group to keep us in the EU. And it says here, Friends of the Earth is proudly party politically impartial. We tell it like it is. All right, okay, yes. No matter who is in government or opposition. But it says campaigning for an in vote in June's referendum is completely consistent with Friends of the Earth's commitment to political impartiality. What they're talking about is party political impartiality. what they're campaigning for is a political position, a fundamentally political position to decide what form of government makes the laws in this country. How much more political can you get? And then we have former EU commissioners, former Labour Party politicians, for instance, Lord Mandelson and Neil Kinnock, coming out and saying we must stay in. What they don't tell you is that they are subject to rules and regulations to protect their EU pensions. This is a story from the Daily Telegraph. European rules show that if Mandelson, in this case, speaks out against Europe as a former commissioner, he could be stripped of his pension altogether. Documents seen by campaigners show that Lord Mandelson and other commissioners like Kinnock have to abide by certain obligations, quote, both during and after their term of office. One of these obligations as a staff member of the Commission is to maintain a duty of loyalty to the communities. If they fail to demonstrate loyalty to the EU, Lord Mandelson and these others can, quote, be deprived of his right to a pension or other benefits, the rules say. Did the EU-funded BBC ask the EU-funded Kinnock and Mandelson about this conflict of interest? Not to my knowledge, they didn't. And we've had calls this week for children, as a matter of course in schools, to be taught the benefits of being in the European Union. Wherever you look, this organisation is stitching up the game by controlling, through funding not least, all sides. And when not by funding, by ignorance of what the game is. And then when we go across to the progressive arena in the United States, we find a similar situation. The Arab Spring, these apparently spontaneous people's revolutions in the Middle East, which have caused devastation in their consequences. And when you do any modicum of research, you see that it was orchestrated from the start to use a people's revolution to target a regime that the cabal wanted to change. And how these revolutionaries, some of them genuine, but again in ignorance of the game, and the others, mercenaries, many of them, were funded, armed and trained by the West to go about their business, apparently in a spontaneous revolution of the people, to target these regimes and people they wanted to remove. Well, one of the key networks that specializes in training people in civil resistance and disobedience is the Open Society network of a billionaire financier and cabal to his DNA called George Soros. As I speak, there is something going on in Washington, D.C. called Democracy Spring, alongside something called Democracy Awakening. And these are people who have been invited to training sessions in the art of civil disobedience, etc., and are protesting, the vast majority quite genuinely, against big business and big money influence in American politics. How many of them, however, know that so many of these organizations in these coalitions that go under these names like Democracy Spring and Democracy Awakening are funded by Soros's Open Society network, the same network that funded the clearly disastrous and premeditated Arab Spring, as it was called. Here is well, there's pages and pages and pages of it, and it's a list, one after the other, after the other, after the other, of progressive organizations funded by George Soros. George Soros has no interest whatsoever in human freedom and human rights, or any of the stuff that these organizations, and in most of their members' case, genuinely believe in. So why is he funding them? I mean, I'm not just saying, here's 10 quid, here's $50. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars that he puts into these organizations, with whose members he will, in fact, have nothing in common at all in terms of what he'd like the world to be. There's an organization called Human Rights Watch. There's a progressive organization for you, human rights. Quite right. Soros, who wouldn't know a human right if it bit him on the arse, gave Human Rights Watch $100 million. Why? Rewind to the start. How do you dictate the outcome of a game before the game starts? You control, direct, manipulate all sides. And those of us, and I share so much in terms of what I would like to happen with the genuine people in these progressive groups. But what needs to happen if it's going to be effective is people need to get informed, and they need to get streetwise about how the world's manipulated, to what end, and see the personalities like Soros that just pop up everywhere. Why are we having a situation where Democracy Spring is demanding that big money and billionaires get out of buying politics and buying influence, when they are connected so fundamentally to billionaire George Soros, who has made an art form out of buying political influence? He supported Obama. That worked, didn't it? In terms of changing anything. And he's supporting Hillary Clinton. And someone else is supporting Hillary Clinton, a man called Robert Kagan, co-founder of something called the Project for the New American Century, known as the neocons in America, who were behind the Bush administration at the time of 9/11, and I've gone into all that elsewhere. Kagan and these neocons are as anti-progressive as you could possibly imagine, but they're supporting Clinton. And Soros, who's funding all these progressive groups, oh, he's progressive, old George, is supporting Clinton. And Clinton is the person they want for the next president, to front up these people in the background like Soros to carry out their agenda when in office. And how many of these progressive groups are supporting Clinton also, when she is, well, I would call her evil, except that evil would probably sue for defamation of character. It's sickening to observe it all. All these people who are campaigning for action on climate change, which are just the changes in society that this cabal wants. There's Friends of the Earth campaigning for action by the EU on climate change, which the EU wants to take because it's part of the same agenda, while being funded by the EU. And unless, like I say, people who are genuinely in pursuit of a fairer, more just and freer world, unless they get informed and get out of their box, stop getting their information from the mainstream media and go and find it elsewhere, because it exists in great amounts if only people would look. Unless they do that, they're going to go on thinking they're making a difference, thinking they are protesting against the system, the state, the establishment. Well, the establishment and the cabal are doing that. This whole progressive arena needs to get informed and needs to grow up, much of it, before we get much further down the road and they realize how much they've been taken and how much they played a part in what by then will be happening. That is the last thing they want to happen. Get informed, and then people can make informed decisions on what they support and what they don't, by knowing what the game is, what the techniques of manipulation are, and what the personalities like Soros are in terms of their real agenda.